Hey, it's your host, Brandon Laws. Welcome to Transform Your Workplace. Today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. It just never ends. Small to mid-sized businesses are drowning in the ever-changing demands of HR administration and compliance. It's just not right. You shouldn't have to lose your focus on growth to take care of your people. In Xenium's complete HR plus payroll model, you can get everything in one place. You can get increased bandwidth, unparalleled expertise, and eventually workplace transformation. Learn more about Xenium's complete HR plus payroll solution at xeniumhr.com. Today's guest is Dr. Gregory Chasson, and today we're discussing his book, Flawed, Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. And I think we've all heard it, I'm a perfectionist. And although that can be a harmless statement and the pursuit of perfectionism can drive growth and innovation and drive you internally, it could also spiral into a toxic work environment and a corporate culture if it becomes so problematic because of excessive and inflexible demands that go beyond considered like what's normal or healthy. So there's a lot of great theory and science behind this that Dr. Chasson brings to the conversation and in the book Flawed. And you're going to hear a lot of tips and tricks about how do we combat the toxic culture of perfectionism. So enjoy today's episode with Dr. Gregory Chasson. Make sure to connect with him on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I'd love to hear how you like the episode. I really enjoyed this conversation. Here it is. Greg, it's a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Your book is out today. It's called Flawed, Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. I've not read a book like this, and nor have I even covered this topic on the podcast. So I'm excited to get going on this. What's the reception been about this topic?
The reception has been a lot of interest, a lot of curiosity. The people who have read it have raved about it, and I'm always a little hesitant to say that because, of course, the people who tell me it's great are the people closest to me, and the people who don't like it are not usually going to say anything. But so far, so good. I think there's something in there for everyone, but it's really geared towards the leaders in the workplace. And, not everyone's a leader in the workplace, or not everyone, cares about this topic, but perfectionism is everywhere. So the idea that it's just restricted to the workplace is, this book was written for the workplace, but it's applicable everywhere.
Absolutely. Yeah. I always found that it seems to start pretty young in kids who are like straight A students, and then they don't know failure. And then when they get to become adults and they don't get, straight A's and trophies, and they actually make some mistakes, they tend to crumble a little bit more. I don't know if you see that in your work, but that's my perception of it.
Yeah, I do. I work a lot with teenagers, and I find that perfectionism tends to show up around this age. And when I say perfectionism, I mean the point at which it becomes a problem. I think the perfectionism has been there for a while, like the tendencies. But around 12, 13 years old, middle school's about where I pinpointed it. There's just a point at which kids cannot keep up doing the same thing that they've been doing since elementary school, which is essentially, overkilling everything, right? I call it nuking the fly, and it really is what kids might do, and they get reinforced for it. They get praise, they get recognition, they get awards, good job, right? And the problem is that's impossible to maintain that level of effort for the rest of your life. And I think middle school is about the time where the tipping point hits. They try, and they just burn. They burn out, and then they come see me.
What was this process of writing a book about perfection like for you? Because at some point you're going to have to hang it up and say, this is good enough, and I'm going to share it with the world and prove that it doesn't have to be perfect.
Yeah, well, that's actually really funny you say that, because I'm still finding errors in the book as I'm reading it. There's a typo here. An important link has the wrong, I'm like slapping my forehead, and then I have to stop and read my own book. Sometimes I think the byline on the front should just say, Greg Chasson, hypocrite, right? Like it just, you do what you can, and you just Look, I've had some of my own perfectionism in the past. I think you could have guessed that based on the fact that I've written a book about it. I don't know that it was ever debilitating, but I certainly can appreciate it and connect with those who do. And it was a process with this book because you could read something 100 times and still find problems with it. And that's still happening. And at some point, you just got to hang it up. And, the people designing the book with me, bless them for putting up with my request to change this and that. At some point, just got to stop. And that's a good chunk of what this book is about. It's a little bit of a meta level experience.
Well, let's get into it. So if somebody answers an interview question, the common one is, what is your greatest weakness? And they answer it with, I'm a perfectionist. What kind of reaction do you give that?
Well, I'm a little bit unique in that I specialize in this. So my reaction is usually a giant but silent cringe on the inside. Not because I think perfectionists are terrible workers. In fact, I would take a perfectionistic worker over most. The problem is that this is usually a cavalier response, right? It's usually done in a way to flip it so that people sound like they've got a strength. To be honest with you, though, it's not a strength most of the time. A lot of the time, it's very paralyzing. And so if someone says this to me, I'll probe it. I'll ask more questions. And I provide some tips in the book about how you can follow up this question. But it really is, in my mind, a starting point to ask more. If you hear this from a reference, I would do the same thing. If a reference is offering information about perfectionism, I would consider that a pretty big red flag, because perfectionism usually coming from a reference means this has been noticed and has become a problem at some level. Otherwise, a reference is not going to even notice. They're just going to call them high achievers and excellent, and their effort is impressive and their work is incredible. But if they call them perfectionistic, that means it's shown at a few points. And I think it's worth following up on that. The question, when someone says it, I'll try to gauge whether it's cavalier or not. Most of the time it is, because people that have real perfectionism or really struggle with it, that's the last thing that they would say in an interview, right? Or if they say it, they downplay it, right? They won't use it as sort of a sign of some sort of a weakness that could be a strength.
When you interact with true perfectionists and you observe it maybe in the workplace as well, how do you define that? Like, maybe define for me what it is and what it is not.
Perfectionism to me has to be differentiated from high standards and flexible standards. High expectations are okay. There's nothing wrong with it. And pursuing perfection is actually quite all right. It's when it becomes rigid and excessive that is the problem. Perfectionism generally is defined by those two features. Excessive expectations go way beyond what's considered normative or healthy relative to industry standards or peers and their performance. And the approach, the behavior, the thoughts tend to be extremely rigid. People do not have an easy time shifting gears and moving on to something different, or again, giving up and saying something is good enough. And so they have this one-track mind. They've been sort of considered sometimes very stubborn in how they approach things. And they'll stick to it even when there's evidence to the contrary right in front of their face. So I would say those things really differentiate perfectionism from high expectations and flexible thinking, which are, in my version, of healthier approaches that parallel perfectionism. And so what I like to do is move people more towards flexible thinking and reasonable expectations, which won't necessarily minimize or get in the way of good products and quality work. It actually will probably improve it.
Do you see perfectionism show up in certain types of people, like professions or ages, anything like that?
I see it everywhere. There are some, I think, professions where we see a higher degree of it. Professions that have what's called a systemizing element, where people like to put systems together. They see things organized. They see things in lists. It's very formulaic, structured. These are the people that would line up their toys or their baseball cards or have all the statistics that they need. Systemizing is an interesting dimension that we all fall somewhere on. I find that people tend to be a little bit more perfectionistic when they show a little bit more of this feature. And so in that way, You'll see a lot of this in Silicon Valley. You'll see a lot of perfectionism in any sort of industry where it's a little bit more systemizing. Engineering, math departments, things like that. But you can see it. You see it everywhere. I see it in physicians. I see it in athletes. Everywhere.
Yeah, I would think like definitely in the sciences, math, engineering, those types of professions where like perfectionism could matter, like getting things right, accurate would matter.
Yeah, the precision is important. It's valued. It's hammered home. I think that reinforces the perfectionistic thinking.
Mm-hmm. How does it show up in the workplace? Like when you see individuals act in a perfectionistic way and that like they carry that trait around with them, how might that show up in the workplace in terms of the work product, of decision making, that kind of thing?
It shows up in a number of different ways. I think just absolute slowing in of productivity. If you see somebody that is at the core of a slowing of processes, I think it's a big red flag, especially if it's across different processes. Somebody might struggle with one particular protocol or task, but if they're struggling to speed up or do things quickly and efficiently on multiple tasks, I would consider perfectionism as my first hypothesis. I think that there's a global concern about perfectionism among these individuals. And so they will bring that approach to all sorts of their work tasks. And so that would be a red flag. And so I would look at the efficiency in the workplace and find people that are struggling. Procrastination is a part of that. Procrastination, in my mind, is often a result of perfectionism.
I never would have thought that.
Yeah, perfectionism leads to all sorts of safety behaviors, things that we do to try to make ourselves feel better in the moment. We'll check things over and over again. We'll seek reassurance from other people. We'll internet research for hours and hours and hours just to make sure that we're doing something right. So those kinds of behaviors are a direct result of perfectionism, and procrastination falls squarely in that category because it's an avoidance behavior. People can't do things perfectly, or they can't do it, quote unquote, just right. They will push it off and just avoid it.
If perfectionism continues to happen amongst individuals, what kind of downstream impacts would it have on a workplace? And it probably varies in size of the organization, but if it truly like started infecting the culture and like the culture, the workplace started behaving in a perfectionistic way, like what are we talking here? Like what kind of impacts are we seeing at the business level?
Tremendous impacts. I think it again slows down all of the efficiency, does a nosedive, productivity plummets. You get individuals who are stuck on making decisions and can't move forward. You get essentially a resentful and toxic workplace. We see some types of perfectionism that project outward. I call it other-oriented perfectionism. So, in other words, people hold really rigid standards of other people instead of just themselves. And we've all worked with folks like this. It can be very difficult, right? They often come across as a bit self-righteous. They are very difficult to work with. And because of their perfectionism, they really have a hard time changing or seeing it. They get rigid about it. And so this can really create a very difficult team dynamic and requires very careful attention.
Do you have any stories of perfectionists that you've run across and where it had a huge negative impact? And hopefully there's a good ending of the story in some ways, but I'm just curious if you could illustrate like the impacts of being a perfectionist, like what that can do, not only to you as an individual, but like how it impacts maybe a team or a culture.
Yeah, I've seen some awful experiences where, and this is unfortunately more common than not, where we get a personality that has something similar to other-oriented perfectionism, where they're projecting their tendencies onto other people and get very rigid about other people doing things just right or by the book. And I've seen entire departments or subdivisions completely turn over because of one individual and having to work with them. It makes, this idea that all it takes is one difficult person to really destroy a dynamic in an organization or in a team. I often think perfectionism might be at the core of some of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So at the individual level, if people are self-aware, like you've been about your perfectionistic tendencies. How do you combat that? How do you unwind that type of behavior? It seems like it'd be like ingrained in how you see the world, but how do you unwind that?
It takes a while. It also requires a lot of patience and effort and a lot of mistakes on purpose and not on purpose. So I tend to, and I talk about this in the book, Flawed, is the last part 2, which is 60% of the book or so, really is all about solutions, offering ideas. And some of them are based on my ideas of how to approach perfectionism. And the emphasis framework is one of those. And I discuss this in an entire chapter. And it goes like this. I see there being 3 ways to approach a task: emphasis A, emphasis B, and emphasis C. Obviously, there's shades of gray in between those, but just for the sake of illustrating, we'll talk about 3. Emphasis A is to do things perfectly, give it your all, give it everything you got, 110%. Emphasis B is just get her done. Just get it done. It doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be garbage, right? But just get it done. And then emphasis C is not to do it at all. It's to strategically choose to ignore it or ghost the task, so to speak, right? And there are times there's a time and a place for all 3 of these. Emphasis A, really good for things like putting together a podcast for that really special perfectionism guest, like really critical, right? Like you want to really put in all your effort.
You know it.
No, I'm kidding. You know it. No, I think it's for things like, a student taking the LSAT or the SATs or somebody that's planning their wedding, somebody that really wants to put a ton of effort into something. It's because it's valued. Values are so critical to making this call. Emphasis B is pretty much for everything else, right? And this is where most people struggle, especially perfectionists. Most things in life deserve nothing more than an emphasis B, right? They're just not that valuable to you. Mostly not that valuable to other people either. And then there's even a time for emphasis C. All the time. I don't know the last time I answered a customer service satisfaction survey at the end of a call, right? I just hang up. Sorry if that's your job and that's what you do, but that is not something that I value. And so I will just hang up, right? Unless I'm really happy or really upset. Anyone that's looked at their own Google reviews knows this, right? But otherwise, I just emphasis C the daylights out of it because it's not important to me. Now with perfectionism, the problem is that people try to emphasis A everything. And it is impossible, right? They try to control everything. They try to emphasize way too much. And what happens is it's because it's not possible, they end up procrastinating or escaping and avoiding. And things ended up get shoved into emphasis C, not by choice, not by strategy, but because of their perfectionism. So things are not getting done. And it wasn't necessarily based on a careful strategic selection of activities based on values, your values or even your organization's values. It was decided on by the perfectionism, right? The perfectionism is what determines what got pushed to the side. And so I often will work with people to engage in emphasis B on most things. I flip the ratio. People with perfectionism, it's mostly emphasis A, very little emphasis B. For everyone else, people without perfectionistic tendencies, it's mostly emphasis B and a little bit of emphasis A. So I try to flip the ratio for people with perfectionism. In doing so, is extremely anxiety provoking. It is essentially what we call exposure therapy in my world of cognitive behavior therapy. Exposure therapy means that you put people in anxiety provoking situations slowly with their informed consent, and you slowly have them approach things that are increasingly more difficult while they at the same time stop engaging in any of those safety behaviors I was talking about earlier. And so that is what we do in treatment, would be to engage people in these emphasis B activities, write the email in less than 30 seconds and shoot it off, right? I would like you to send this email, but I'd like you to make a mistake on purpose. I would like you to misspell their name or misspell the sign off, right? Or send it to the wrong gym, right? Not the wrong gymnasium, the wrong gym, like Jim the worker, right? We've all done that on accident. Like, oop, I sent that to the wrong. And so you have people make mistakes on purpose. And that blows people's minds. You want me to do what? Make mistakes on purpose? Yeah, it's actually an exercise that I'll do with people. And the reason is because it helps to loosen people's thinking, right? They're not so rigid about making mistakes. They don't see it as so catastrophic. And most importantly, they see that they can actually tolerate the anxiety.
Yeah, that's well said, because I feel like people with perfectionistic tendencies, they do get paralyzed, and then they might not put something out in the world or delay doing something out of fear, like they're going to make a mistake, it's not going to be perfect, and then their life will crumble. But like what happens probably in those experiments, those little activities that you're doing where they make a mistake, is they realize it isn't so bad, like the world didn't end, I'm okay.
Right. And that learning is so critical to what I do as a therapist with patients. I see no reason that that principle can't be translated to work. Not in any way. I absolutely think that those kinds of principles can be applied. Now, I wouldn't call it therapy. I don't think you're doing therapy with them, but I think that you can create an environment where you are purposefully promoting flexibility and occasionally promoting mistake making on purpose.
Can this framework be applied to a group setting? Because it does seem, in the workplace, it gets complicated when you're now working with teams and your success is wrapped up into somebody else, or maybe even a perfectionistic boss. Like that's a whole different layer. How do we take that approach?
It's a great question. Actually, in the book, I have top down and bottom up approaches to helping people with perfectionism. The top down is really how can you affect the culture of the workplace, the organization, so that it's not essentially setting up perfectionists to struggle. And then I have individual strategies that a manager, a leader, could take and work with an individual employee who's struggling. A lot of the principles and the treatment, the techniques are similar, but examples that I provide are really preventive rather than interventions. So can you create a culture from the outset that is not perfectionistic? A lot of people do things unwittingly, not understanding that they're creating a culture of perfection or perfectionism, such as, praising people out in the community. They think having, a giant whiteboard with the sales numbers and praising people for their being on the top of the leaderboard is motivating, and it is for a lot of people. But for the people who have put in every ounce of their energy and they're not cracking the top 10, it can be extremely demoralizing, and that can create a cycle where they're just spiraling downward. And so just understanding that kind of environment, it does motivate some people, but it will have a negative effect, an opposite effect on others. And so but in general, that kind of a culture where those things are happening can actually reinforce this notion of perfectionism. And so I think we just need to go in with our eyes wide open a little bit more, knowing what techniques might be promoting this idea that we expect nothing less than perfect.
Respond to this quote from General George Patton that you had in the book. The quote says, "A good plan executed now is better than a perfect plan next week," end quote. What does that mean to you?
That to me is a very wise comment from a very wise public official. I think we often get so stuck in trying to perfect the outcome and the plan. And that chapter where I start that quote is really about the plan. I call it process paralysis. And the idea is that people get so stuck trying to come up with the optimal strategies or come up with the optimal steps that they get so stuck that they don't even do the task that's before them. They might try to figure out what's the best way to put this Lego set together without looking at the instructions. And then they get so paralyzed trying to figure out the best way of doing this that they end up not even putting it together at all. It's an example of where it's a little bit like analysis by paralysis, but it's basically focused entirely on the process. And I see it in two different ways. People get stuck on the optimal strategy. What's the best way to do this? What's the best way to do it? I got to figure it out. And so they'll sit on the internet and they'll ask, they'll be on the deepest, darkest Reddit and subreddits, and they'll be trying to figure out. And then there's the other type where they're trying to figure out the optimal order of operations. Right? So if they can even get past which optimal strategy to choose, then they figure out what is the best way to do this, right? Do I go about it this way or do I go about it that way? And, if there are infinite possibilities, you're stuck, you're paralyzed. And so the process paralysis piece is what I think Patton is referring to in that quote, because oftentimes we're so stuck on trying to plan on the battlefield and trying to win the war that what's happening right before us, we're just going to lose. We're going to lose that battle right in front of us if we're too busy worrying about tomorrow. And it's really just a strategy for telling people to perfect is the enemy of the good. It's a very similar concept.
I laughed really hard at the section about the meta meeting.
Yeah.
Describe what that is so listeners get a sense for what the meta meeting is and why you think it's absurd.
Yeah, you're giving away all my good stuff.
Anybody can relate to this.
Yeah,
That's good.
Movie trailers always give you the best stuff, right? So a meta meeting to me is this idea of meetings about meetings. And I see them as having degrees, like degrees of Kevin Bacon, so to speak. So you have just a regular meeting, which is about some substantive issue, which is normal. And then you have meetings about meetings, which to me starts to get a little absurd, right? You've got, there's the in the moment meta meeting where you stop and say, how's this meeting going? Do we feel like this meeting's going well? And it's sort of a process moment, which is fine. That's really kind of common. And it's good for making things more efficient. But then there's meetings about future meetings, which kind of start to get a little bit nuts, right? So you're starting to think about, let's strategize about our meeting coming up, right? Let's strategize about our meeting coming up. And so you're sitting there in a room, having a meeting, talking about another meeting. And again, it gets a little absurd, but what gets really, I think, mind-numbing is when it becomes 3 or 4 degrees out. It's a meeting about a meeting. That meeting is also about another meeting. So it's a meeting about a meeting about a meeting. And you start to lose track, and it becomes like an inception of meetings. And it's, but not nearly as entertaining as Christopher Nolan's movie, right? And so you're just sitting there having a meeting about some future meeting. That future meeting is all about strategizing for a third meeting. And you're slapping your head going, what am I doing? Is this even reality right now?
It's incredible. And everybody's going to relate to that one because we've all had a meeting about a meeting. Seems silly. How do rules, policies, principles, how do those all play a role in perfectionism? Do they make it worse, better?
It's a good question. It really, I think, starts with a confusion of rules and principles. As a starting point, we'll go there. People with perfectionism tend to conflate those. Rules are necessary. We all abide by rules. Well, maybe not you. You seem kind of like a rebel. But rules are there for a reason. But those rules are built on principles. And principles, in turn, are built on values. And the problem with people with perfectionism is they often lean heavily into the rules at the expense of the principles or values. So the examples that I give in the book are, you might have a value of punctuality. Maybe the organizational value values punctuality. There's a set of principles around that, such as, maybe you leave for work on time, maybe get your stuff ready the night before. If you're late, maybe you apologize. Like just these general things that build this principled approach to being punctual. And then there are specific rules that are built on this, such as you better be there at 7:00 or you're going to get written up. And so there are rules built on principles, built on values. And a lot of people with perfectionism, they get so stuck on the rules that they don't even understand or see the principles or values underlying it. They get so rigid about it and they start to police it, either themselves or other people. And it becomes a real problem for the workplace and for the worker, him or herself. Rules have a place, but in general, I try to encourage people to live by principles rather than the rules. Rules are critical, but they should not be carried out to such a degree that it's actually undermining the principle. So the classic example I have of this in my clinical work was working with somebody on the autism spectrum. And this individual, by the way, people on the spectrum tend to have higher rates of perfectionism and they get pretty rigid in their thinking. And in this particular individual fell right into that characterization. And one of his issues was that he was so fixated on the rules of grammar that while you're having a conversation with him verbally, he would stop you every 3 seconds to correct your grammar. And at one point, the therapeutic approach to this was, hey, let's talk about the rules versus principles. What's the principle of speaking to somebody? And he was not stupid. He was a very bright human being. And he said, I guess it's, clear communication, communicating a message. And I said, how is your fixation on the rules getting in the way of that? And so that's what I mean by conflating these things. And he was so stuck on the rules that it actually undermined the principle that was driving that rule in the first place.
Yeah. The example, it's not in your book that I remember, but I'm a huge sports fan. NFL, NBA in particular, where there's sports have tons of rules, and rules are there for a reason. We need them, right? But when you have a referee that is blowing the whistle every 2 seconds because of a rule that's written in the rule book, it slows down the game, and then it's not entertaining. So you actually have a really poor experience for the people who love the sport and want to watch and be entertained by stopping the gameplay. So that's
a great example. And I think it extends beyond that, not just for the spectator, but for the athletes, right? They're going to be so hyper focused on not breaking rules that that the game's going to change, right? Which is just, I think, not fair for anyone involved. And it's really just because somebody is so rigid about the rules.
Why is the word should toxic in your opinion?
Should to me is a word that needs to be banished from the English language and all of its cousins, ought to, have to. This is usually an indication of some perceived universal truth that the person thinks that exists. So I should be a good dad. I should be a good podcaster. I ought to be good in bed. I should be the world's best athlete. The amount of shoulds in our world is overwhelming. We all experience it, and it can lead us down really difficult paths. They create unattainable, universal expectations that just completely crush us. And so what I like to do is point these out to people when they're experiencing it and get them to try to loosen and flex their thinking around this, because should statements can be absolutely shackling.
Let's end with this, because I know there's a lot of people out there that deal with perfectionistic bosses. How can we as individuals deal with them, maybe even manage up if we have to?
Well, I would tell them to, go check out my book as a number one. You can buy it for them for the for the Christmas party at the end of the
Love it. Just drop it on their desk. No passive aggressiveness at all there.
Right. That would be the most passive aggressive move in the history. I wouldn't suggest that. Although you certainly could see if you can get it in their hands and say, this book is awesome, and see if they'd be interested in reading it. But I think the two main things to do here are to set boundaries and to use assertiveness. And those are two things that require some practice, especially for people who are not used to it. Boundary setting is hard enough, and in order to do that, you need to be assertive. So the first step would be to learn how to be assertive. And this is difficult for a lot of people. It's very worth it to me, though, because it is, in my opinion, the most effective way to communicate in a way that generally protects your relationships, preserves your self-respect, and will get you what you need a good chunk of the time. The other approach is like aggressive. You could get what you want, but you're going to piss off everyone around you and you're going to destroy relationships. You might even end up behind bars, right? Passive, you're not going to get anything that you need. In fact, you're going to get trampled on. Now, you're going to protect your relationships in the moment, but I think in the long run, people are going to gravitate towards you because they can manipulate you, and those relationships aren't going to be worth it anyway. And then, of course, there's what we just talked about, passive-aggressive, which to me is the king of all disastrous communication styles. I can't really think of many good opportunities or reasons to use passive aggression. This, to me, is a recipe for all the bad things that come from aggression and passivity, and none of the good stuff that comes from being assertive. So I would encourage assertion, and I can't really go into too much detail about what that looks like on this podcast. But if you're interested, I would encourage you to check it out. I put some resources on my website that you could go to and check out those books. The chapter 9 and 10 of my book, Flawed, will discuss a little bit about that. And it's geared towards helping people get an appetizer for assertiveness, because I think it's so critical for working with perfectionistic bosses and coworkers. The other thing, boundaries, is also really critical. And it really, again, to harp on this, it really needs to go back to values. Values are the best things to use as a compass for determining what boundaries to set. Now, this is really important because it can't just be your values. It's got to be all the values of everyone around you as well, including the organization. Why do I say that? Because you value your job. Most of the time, I'm sure you value your job. Well, if you don't value your job, you value financial security or intellectual curiosity or the relationships in your job, whatever it is, you value it. Otherwise, why are you doing it? Right? And so you may not directly value what your organization values, but you value the organization. And so I would encourage you to incorporate that into your calculus when you're thinking about setting boundaries. Why do I say this? Because there's often a tendency for people to set really strict boundaries with their employer or boss that doesn't really even begin to flexibly consider what the values of the organization are. Now, I'm not saying that you need to be walked all over by the employer, but I think it is a conversation to have, not just a dictation, right? Here are my boundaries, abide by them, that's it, be done. I think you certainly have every right and ought to, here I'll use the word should, tell people what you think would be best for you boundary-wise, but be prepared to negotiate and pick your battles, right? Pick your battles. I think oftentimes people don't realize that. You're spending social capital every time you do this kind of a thing, and there's only so much of it. So those are my strategies.
Yeah, Greg, your book is called Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. The book is out today. Today is April 16th. Congratulations on the book launch. Where do you want to point people to? Like your website, the book, all of the above?
Yeah, thank you for asking. My book can be found at flawedbook.com, which is a bit of a unfortunate URL, but flawedbook.com. Maybe it's in the spirit of perfectionism or anti-perfect. So flawedbook.com. And then you could also go check out more resources on my website, as well as look at very excellent pictures of me and read other things. gregchasson.com, GregChass as in Sam, O N as in Nancy.com.
Awesome. We'll put links to all of the resources in the show notes. My guest today has been Dr. Greg Chasson. Greg, pleasure to have you on.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.